Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. And I rarely get to say we have a character to talk about today, but we have a character as a guest, and that's Charles Swenson, South Austin native, class of 72 from Austin Travis. I will leave the class cheer to your imagination. So, Charles, with that incredibly long-winded introduction, first of all, welcome. And thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
I'm more than glad to be here, and I appreciate your taking an interest in this. I'm really looking forward to it.
Let's just start there because I want to use your book and this topic as really simply the starting point to explore a lot of different topics. You are the author of Voices from Camptown. Can you tell us what is Camptown and what was your involvement in the project that led to the book?
Yeah, Camptown is a community it's actually a freedom colony that was established in Brenham following the Civil War when the formerly enslaved blacks needed to have a place to live. And although there was already a pretty significant population of them in Brenham, nonetheless, they started gathering around the camp that it refers to as the Union Camp that was established by the federal forces after the Texans finally surrendered, not at Appomattox, but several months afterwards. And when they did, the federal troops came in and they would establish different freedmen bureaus around the state of Texas to help give these formerly enslaved blacks who were now liberated a chance to go ahead and thrive, because they did need quite a bit of protection. They had been formerly considered property by many of these people and the source of their wealth, and then suddenly they had been set free. A lot of the former people who considered themselves owners were not real happy about that, and there needed to be an amount of protection. So Camptown refers to the camp that a lot of them gathered around. It was a Union Camp to the east, about a mile east of what was then Brenham. And Camptown Cemetery, now, that is a cemetery there that I was unaware of completely. I first came to Brenham with a good friend of mine, Bob Wishoff. Bob Wishoff and I had been interested in archaeology for quite a while, actually. He really drew me into it. He had a real abiding interest in it and eventually was working on his master's degree at Southwest Texas. And when he was doing his research for his master's thesis at Alabate's Flint Quarries National Monument in North Texas, I did a lot of work with him up there too. We did a lot of work going through the old artifacts that have been stored up there from when the Flint Quarries were first being investigated back in the 20s and 30s. And a lot of these had never really been looked at before after they've been stored there. So we went through a lot of that. So we have a long history going back. And after he had gotten his degree in archaeology, he was asked by the director of the Brenham Heritage Museum to come up there and help find some archaeology sites up there to try to gin up some interest for the museum. We were looking for various different things. We did a few digs at a few of the more famous houses around there, but we also were looking for this site where Custer had stayed. Custer came through Brenham shortly before he had his Indian experience up at Little Bighorn, but we were kind of looking for that. In the interim, we were wondering where this Union camp was, because we came across, there was this Union camp in Brenham. Where was it? We did not quite know. In the process, we met Eddie Harrison. Eddie Harrison is a real key element for me in learning about Camptown and an abiding interest for me. I actually tried to really dedicate as much of the book as I could to Eddie. Eddie is, almost anyone in Brenham who's anyone during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s, and 90s, and 20s, and 2010s knew Eddie Harrison. He had formerly been a high muck in the military. I'm afraid I'm not good on military ranks and everything, but he was way on up there. But he didn't wear that on his sleeve. He had been a former judge. He didn't wear that on his sleeve. He was a deacon at Mount Rose Baptist Church. He had been a county extension agent, and he had an abiding interest in Black history and history in general, but especially in Black history in Brenham and Washington County. And he had an opportunity to go out as an extension agent and learn a great deal about the history of the area directly from some of the people who had been involved in it, specifically from Black communities, which had not been really represented in any of the histories of Brenham. I became quite interested in these things later, but this comes later. It was Eddie who, when we were asking around at the museum about the Union camp, he said, "Oh yeah, it was right on the other side of Camptown Cemetery." Where's Camptown Cemetery? And he said, "Come on, we'll show you." And we followed him out to it, and we were absolutely amazed that this was a cemetery. It was at the end of a dead-end street. It was quite ironic that there was actually a large dead-end sign right as you drove into the cemetery. And many of the people actually who lived in the vicinity weren't really aware that it was a cemetery. It was overgrown, and when I say overgrown, it was like a small jungle in there. And it was hard to believe it really was a cemetery, except you could see one or two tombstones just on the outer edge of it. Beyond that, you couldn't see much. It was so overgrown. And he took us back in there a little bit, and we started going back further and further into it. And the more we went into it, further and further, it was amazing how many tombstones there were in there, dating back from the 1870s, the 1880s. And he was telling us, yeah, this is where a lot of the Blacks were buried here from Brenham, because, of course, they weren't really allowed to be buried in the other cemeteries. And this had been a cemetery even prior to the Union camp, and was kind of a known area to them. And that was what really sparked my interest in Camptown Cemetery. And there is a very long answer to a very short question.
So how did you use the Camptown Cemetery as a starting point to tell the tale of Camptown, of Blacks in Washington County or near Brenham, or maybe even the start of Reconstruction and Jim Crow up until today?
As we were going through the cemetery, of course, there were all these names on these gravestones. It was clear that there were more graves than gravestones, because we had to be a little careful back there time and again, because there would be these areas that we would walk into, and it's like the ground starts sinking underneath you. You see a little divot under you. You realize you're walking over a lot of graves in there, but there were a pretty good number of gravestones. And then we had names and dates on them, dates of birth and dates of death. And there had been a small census of the cemetery that had been done prior to this. Eddie had been trying to, actually, he was already in the process of getting designation as a Texas Historical Cemetery from the Texas State Historical Association for the cemetery. And in the process, a census had been begun, but I started adding to that too. And I started wondering more about who are these people that were buried here? Who are these people? And about that time, it was fortunate, serendipitous coincidence, the portal to Texas history opened up, which is a digital newspaper archive. And a lot of the Brenham papers from that same time period were in it. It's a searchable database, and I started plugging in some of these names. And when I did, I started getting bits and pieces of stories, and suddenly it's like I began to understand who some of these people were in here. I was catching little snippets and glimpses of their lives. And the more I dug, the more I realized there are really quite a few stories in here waiting to be told that could be put together just simply from going through these old newspaper archives. I spend a lot of time going through the Brenham papers. I sometimes feel like there's a part of me that lives in Old Brenham, but I started getting more of a feel for the town. A lot of these stories started intersecting with each other. And I began to get a better and better feel for not only some of these individuals, but for the Camptown community as a whole. And that was something that was really of a growing interest. A lot of people did not know even about Camptown anymore. It used to be called Camptown by the people in the community and the town. But a lot of people were just completely unaware of this history, that it existed there before.
So why should the Camptown Cemetery, in your opinion, receive a historical designation?
That was one of Eddie's stories. He used to say, there is no black history and white history. There's only history. And it was something that was really, has always stuck with me. This was a significant part of history that had not really been told before. There were some histories of Brenham out there, and they did not touch upon the black community except very much in passing, which really was not indicative of what the community was back then, the larger community. In the 1850 and 1860 censuses, there were actually more blacks in Brenham and in Washington County than there were whites. And there were all of these people whose stories were not being told. 1860 census, there are 2 blacks listed. Although if you go through the slave schedules, which were put together for the census, there are far more. And those 2 blacks, the only 2 blacks in there that have names in the census, all they have is a first name. Suddenly, I had all of these names of so many people who had previously been completely out of the historic record, except as property. And suddenly, there were these individuals whose story I really felt needed to be told, because there was something incomplete in the history of Brenham and Washington County, and frankly, of a lot of other parts of the country.
As you move forward after the end of the war and during Reconstruction, Jim Crow and thereafter, did you begin to see families of blacks buy or own property? And then following the property records, you could see how those families either expanded or sometimes contracted their holdings?
Absolutely. That was one of the things that actually fascinated me. These were people who had previously been considered property, who were suddenly in there and buying up property and creating their own community. And they did. They owned a lot of land. And true, it's going back through the real estate records. There are a lot of opportunities to see that these were very transactional people in their community. They were actually, some of them were fairly well-to-do and got to be more well-to-do. I don't want to say real estate speculators, but they understood the value of owning, buying, and selling land. And there is a lot to be learned from going through those real estate records as well. I was also very fortunate that a good part of the Washington County records where those real estates are recorded are also online in a searchable base. So I had a confluence of really fantastic research opportunities at my hand. And that's what I started trying to merge all of these together into bigger and greater stories of the individuals and of the community in Camptown.
Were you able to see, so I currently live near Kerrville, and there's a well-documented, or was a well-documented, black school system in Kerrville. And were you able to document the black schools, because we both lived at a time where segregation was still a part of the Texas educational system? Were you able to see that growth of the black school system in Brenham or the greater Washington County?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I was. One of the stories that is not in this book, but which I really hope to get out there in the future, has to do with the Freedmen schools in Brenham and Washington County. The Freedmen's Bureau, which is actually, it was very much involved in the education process. A lot of the Freedmen Bureau records are now also online, courtesy of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, which has an excellent website up through which, amongst other things, they have the Freedmen Bureau records. Previously, those were only really available on microfilm at the National Archive sites, but now these were available and online as well. So I was able to go through those and actually pull together records of all of the different schools. There were numerous schools around Washington County that had been established by the Freedmen's Bureau, and one of those was in Brenham, and as a matter of fact, it was right next to where the cemetery is. It was on some land that had previously been owned by Louisa Mangrum, who unfortunately her story didn't make it into this edition. The original schoolhouse was the sutler's cabin that they had at the old Union camp. Wiley Hubert had bought that up, and with funds from the Freedmen's Bureau, they actually were able to renovate that and turn it into one of the first schoolhouses for blacks there in Brenham.
As we move through into the 20th century and through World War II, perhaps, were you able to see changes in the black community and maybe even when some of the veterans came back from World War II?
My research did not really go that far. Initially, there were not that many records available to me. And since my main interest was in the cemetery, there were a number of World War I and the war with the Philippines, Spanish-American War, who were buried there. As a matter of fact, there were a few people, especially who were essential in helping establish the cemetery, who had been in the Civil War. And that actually was a key element because there were actually a number of veterans that were from those previous wars. The cemetery had pretty much gone out of use by the time of the Second World War, but there were veterans from these other wars that were there. An essential part of actually getting the cemetery cleaned was we had several motorcycle clubs of veterans who helped us clear out the cemetery, which was a major effort. And their efforts, because they realized that they did have a lot of veterans there, that was essential in really helping to get the cemetery cleared out. But patriotism actually ran very high amongst the black community there, and you can really see it in looking through the records. These were people very proud of their military heritage, as Eddie was. Eddie's grandfather was a Harlem hellfighter who had participated in World War I in a military capacity, and was quite proud of it.
Let me ask you a little bit about your writing process. I'm always fascinated to talk to another writer. With a book of history or nonfiction, you sort of outline everything, have it all laid out. Is it laid out in your head and you just sit down and write it? What's your process, Charles?
That's a good question. I often ask myself there. I wish I could outline and write that way. A lot of these stories evolved as I started learning the stories by going through the different sources that I have. The more information I came across, the more I realized how there really was a full, good-sized chunk of a biographical essay I could put into place. And then it was a matter of just knowing the resources of course, copied all of the old ones, and then I would start trying to put it into a rough chronological basis. And that helped. But it really kind of evolved organically, knowing that these stories needed to be told and trying to gin up some more interest in other people in it. These were stories. History is actually best told in the process of stories. And in the process of telling stories and telling these stories of the individuals in the cemetery that were buried there, there was actually a chance to tell a broader story of history, not only of Camptown, but of those periods of time in a time and place that I really had no idea about. I'm an old white guy. What do I know about what it was like living with it as a black person? During those times or even afterwards, I learned a lot from my friends and people who were helping me with this, things that I had no concept of. And it was a learning experience for me, not only about Brenham and Black history, but about just the Black experience, which is quite different than what I know. I continue to learn about it. And these stories would start to evolve, and I realized that after a while, this didn't happen overnight. I started writing these short pieces. The chapters basically were written individually, and I started seeing how they could come together in a larger book. And last year, I actually put these together in the book because I wanted to have them collected for people who are interested in them. And I realized in the process of doing that, this is actually a book. And thank goodness for Stony Creek, because I really had a hard time this is history. It is. Hopefully it's not a real dry style. But I'm not an academic. The highest degree I hold is an associate degree in nursing. I'm an RN, critical care RN. But I realized that even though I don't really write in an academic style, I haven't been trained that way, I just merely consider myself an avocational historian. I realized that nonetheless, this was a really important story that if I didn't tell it, it wasn't going to get told.
That really leads to the next point I wanted to visit with you about, Charles, which is your own journey with Stony Creek. Can you tell us, maybe walk us through for a few minutes what that was like and how they may have helped you in getting this book to publication?
Again, this was not an academic book, but I realized it was important. I was familiar with academic presses to some extent. My friend Bob Wishoff that I mentioned earlier, he had a website called dirtbrothers.org, and he would write reviews of archaeology books that were sent to him by various academic presses. And as part of where I learned my writing capacity, he really prompted me to do that by saying, here's a book, write something about it for a review, and where I learned a lot of parsing. But I realized I really wasn't up to this. I knew the academic presses, but also it's like, I'm not up to snuff for this. And quite frankly, as I learned from Lauren later, the wait time to even have a manuscript considered in some of these academic presses is just onerous. The Texas A&M Press has a consortium of different presses that they advertise and that they are working with. And Stony Creek was one of those. And I realized that this might be the kind of opportunity that I really needed as sort of outlet. Non-academic, but nonetheless kind of rooted in Texas history. And when I learned that Lauren was in Wimberley, I'm not that far from it. I have fond memories of Wimberley. I've lived there in the past for short periods of time. And I like to meet the people that I'm working with in person. And I realized this was a confluence of coincidences that I needed to work with here. And that's how I got to work with Lauren there at Stony Creek Publishing. And he was very kind. he's very professional. I realized that although this was not academic press, that he was really demanding a lot of me. Going through that editing process, I sometimes think that was actually much more difficult than the process of writing them, putting this all together. But I realized, and he realized too, the importance of getting this right. And I really appreciate that from a publisher. It's sort of like with a publisher or an editor, and he did hook me up with a really good editor. A person who tries to edit their own work is like a lawyer trying to represent himself. It's not a good idea at all. And I learned a lot actually in the process.
Charles, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners are interested in finding out more about the book or would want to check out your website, what would be the best place or places for them to go? And of course, we'll put that in the show notes.
I have a blog spot that I used to work with. So it's a web page that I was just working with because I wanted to get a lot of stories out. And that's camptowncemetery.blogspot.com. I've been working with a group of like-minded individuals in Brenham in Washington County who are also interested in this. And we have put together a website that is still in the process of evolution, and that is texas10.org, and that's tx10.org. And the book should be coming out next month sometime.
Charles, this has been a fascinating exploration of a part of Texas history that unfortunately, as you said, has not been given the attention it deserves. And I hope that our listeners will buy your book so that they can learn more about this. And I hope we can continue this conversation.
Oh, I would love to anytime. You get me going on it, it's hard to get me to stop.